Hey, hi, and hello, everyone. Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. I hope you're doing well. I am hopping on camera here to talk about an interesting occurrence. We have been following here and there some of the new remixed versions of classic albums in the Beatles catalog. These mixes have ranged in terms of quality and also the amount of intrigue they invoke in me. So, of course, I was pretty psyched to listen to the remix of this new one for Revolver, which creatively speaking, I think is one of the better Beatles records, obviously pretty groundbreaking for them, and also, you know, a very essential moment in terms of heading more into an experimental and psychedelic direction, which would lay the groundwork for a lot of the albums to come. Loads of ink has been spilled on the Beatles' progression. I assume at this point nobody sort of needs the full context of the Revolver album explained to them like they're a child. But look, the full remix of the album is out, and I have some thoughts and opinions on the way each of these tracks has turned out. It's a pretty interesting result that we've got here, which I was a little wary of because while I do love Revolver, it is not one of my favorite mixed albums from the Beatles as far as production goes. I think, you know, a record like Abbey Road is superior, one of the best produced rock records of all time. But with that being said, the remix of that album felt so inconsequential that it kind of came across as pointless in my opinion, but also, you know, kind of validated my long-held thoughts that, you know, it is already an immaculately produced project. What the hell else can you do with it? Meanwhile, the White Album, which is a very versatile and very wild array of tracks, which in terms of like variety and amount of like bases covered and different instrumental palettes, I think is a little more, you know, alike Revolver in terms of just how out of control it feels. Obviously, White Album much more so. Some of the mixes on the White Album remix, in my opinion, did get botched. They did get botched. My favorite track off of the record, or at least in my top 5, Helter Skelter, definitely got fucking ruined, as did a few other tracks, in my opinion. So I was kind of hoping that I don't know, maybe they would play it a little safer with Revolver. But look, as I was alluding to earlier, I'm actually pretty happy to hear what was done on this remixed version of Revolver. And, you know, going track by track, here is why. To kick things off with the classic opener, Taxman, the bass and kick drum on this track are bumping almost as hard as like you would hear in a modern rock track or a hip hop song, which is a little odd, you know, to kind of feel like that oomph coming off of like a Beatles track, but it's there and it's punchy and honestly, it sounds pretty freaking good. Maybe it does change the vibe and dynamic a little too much to a degree because there are like similar instrumental palettes on the album that don't quite get that intense of a bass treatment, but I suppose if you were going to do it on one track here, this one would be the one. I wouldn't say I prefer it to the original, but it does make me think of the song in a different way, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The following, Eleanor Rigby, is one of the most iconic Beatles songs of all time, of course, and, you know, is based mostly around those lead vocals and string sections, and the strings feel a lot fuller this time. Seems like there's a touch of compression on there, but also quite a bit more low end, and I'm liking that. It does not sound as thin as it did in the original mix. Whole thing comes across a little bit louder, but not so much that it feels like it's destroying the dynamics of the track entirely. There are going to be some purists at the end of the day that are not going to be happy with any change in dynamics, of course. Then I'm Only Sleeping struck me a little bit, not because it felt so much louder or so much more compressed, but everything it had to offer as far as instrumentation felt much wider. Like it was a more panoramic experience. The acoustic guitar just felt like it was placed in a more wide fashion. The vocal harmonies felt like they were coming at me from all directions. Whole thing just felt a lot less focused in the center, and I liked that. It just kind of felt like I was more immersed in the song, and I think that's cool. Which I also very much felt was the case for Love 2 to Follow, which is, you know, obviously George Harrison's Raga cut that has never been one of my favorites on the LP, but the newfound sound in this mix does, you know, make it a little bit more appealing. Then on to Here, There, and Everywhere. It's on this track that the vocal harmonies are what really truly shine on this one. And it's to the point where I'll go as far as to say I kind of prefer this version to the original. I would rather listen to this version than what is on the first Revolver mix, mostly because it just kind of feels like, I don't know, maybe this is the way it was intended to sound. Because because truth be told, if there ever has been an issue I've had with Revolver sound overall, it's that it runs a little thin. I think the low end is a bit emaciated at points, and these mixes overall, but especially on this track, solve that problem entirely. Then we move on to Yellow Submarine, which is obviously another major iconic Beatles track. The presentation this time around is pretty interesting. The group vocals on the chorus are actually insane. They are very full. They're very panoramic again. I feel like I am in the room with them as they're all, kind of group singing. We all live in a yellow submarine. The one major surprise for me mix-wise was that I expected the sound effects to go a lot harder, but instead this time around we hear more of a balance between, the waves and, the kooky submarine machinery and so on and so forth, and the backing instrumentation. And ultimately, maybe that's a good thing. Obviously, on that original mix, it's very much the sound effects that are kind of taking over and kind of creating a theater of the mind type situation, but there just seems to be more balance now, and that's cool. The song She Said already leans into what were, pretty much the stars of the show of this track. That's Ringo's drum fills, that's George Harrison's very bold lead guitars. Honestly, the lead guitars are so clear and so in your face, but without being too loud on this track. I feel like I've never been so intimately aware of every nuance of the playing on that track, which I would also say is very much the case for the piano on Good Day Sunshine. I feel like I am fucking in that thing as it is playing on this track, but this newfound clarity is not always to the benefit of the recordings I have found, like with the following And Your Bird Can Sing, because on this cut, not every vocal harmony hits, and on top of that, the chorus effects on the already harmonized vocals come across a little obnoxious, not to mention those like single downstroked rhythm guitars that were hanging very appropriately far in the background of the last mixes is now just like almost right up front and center, and it doesn't sound all that great. Maybe as a bit of texture in the original mix, it sounded, all right. Then on For No One, love this ballad. It's an amazing Beatles song, one of my favorites, but I've never been so aware of the rhythm section on this track. It was always so quiet in the original that you never really had to think about it in any way whatsoever. And not that it's loud in this new mix, but like it is very much there, and you kind of pick up on it right away. And I will say this is one of the tracks that I didn't think needed to be compressed as aggressively as it was, but there is still like a nice little rush of low end on the chorus through the piano and the bass and everything.
I am enjoying how prominent the bass is in these mixes.
The clarity on Dr. Robert, I think, makes the band sound so freaking tight, or at least, kind of makes how tight they are playing on that track so much more obvious. Meanwhile, on I Want to Tell You, it is actually Ringo's snare that is going crazy. The snare is so freaking loud on this track. I don't know why. I guess it's not like Saint Anger snare loud, but the snare is popping on this cut. The snare fans in the comments are going to go wild off this track. Then it's on Got to Get You Into My Life, where the horn sections, were already obviously the star of the show on the original mix, but they sound so much better and clearer and more beautiful in this new mix. Not to mention Paul McCartney's yells, his screams, the points at which vocally he's digging down really deep are just hitting so much harder than they were before. I got to get you into my life. And again, with these moments on the record where we are getting kind of these cultural crossovers as a result of, George Harrison and bringing the sitar into the fray and everything, never been my favorite moments on the record before, but with the closer, I actually love the sound of this song now. It was obviously so much better of a track than Love You To off the bat, but with the bass and the vocals and the droning sitars all going off in the mix on this, newly minted version, it sounds fantastic. Sounds amazing. Sounds full. Sounds really psychedelic. Sounds really surreal. Sounds really freaking otherworldly. I'm loving it. Loving it. Loving it. So yeah, overall, really pleased with a lot of the mixes on this record. I want to quickly go over the additional discs of material that are added to the super deluxe version of this mix. There are 2 other discs of alternate takes and demo versions and so on and so forth, a lot of which are really, really, really interesting. After that, with another disc, you have mono versions of all the tracks off the record because, obviously you have those Beatles fans that are sticklers and kind of obsessed with having a stereo version, a mono version, and I get it. I understand why. Not as crazy about the mono versions as the stereo versions, but for those who are really truly interested in that sort of thing, there are mono versions there. It's a really good and proper and satisfying rundown. Obviously, like the amount of extra material offered isn't as dense as what you're hearing on a record as massive as the White Album. Still cool, interesting additions to the overall package. But yeah, overall, like really pleased with this new version. Really pleased. It sounds fuller. It sounds crisper. It sounds clearer. It sounds bassier. Felt like they actually brought something to the table. The changes they made were tasteful. I think there can be some debate as to whether or not they were necessary. But again, as a longtime fan of the album who always thought it could use a little, just a smidge more low end, just a smidge more bass-a-rooney, I'm finally getting that now, and it feels kind of nice. And I think I will leave it there. Those are my thoughts on this new version of Revolver. Make sure to throw down in the comments yours if you so wish to do so. And yeah, you're the best. Love you. Anthony Fantano, Revolver, Beatles, forever.